Okay, so in addition to sort of a, kind of a straight structural, division of the nervous system to try to get a handle on, what different components and parts are actually involved in and doing, we can also sort of approach the nervous system functionally and say, okay, so this is something that our nervous systems do. What are some of the structural features associated with that? Are there distinguishing structural features associated with what functionally is going on with networks of neurons? And it turns out that, yes, that's true. So, for example, there are going to be sort of discrete, kinds of network connections that are involved in, aspects of sort of intentional behavior and, perception of, what's going on, et cetera, and sort of deliberative responses, behavioral responses to our environments. This is sometimes, thought of as like the somatic nervous system. But at the same time, there's also stimuli that can provoke sort of coordinated, sort of behavioral responses, kind of automatically. This is sometimes thought of as sort of like what's known as the autonomic nervous system. This is going to involve, afferent detection of stimuli, and then sort of more stereotyped kinds of behavioral responses, often very rapid behavioral responses, often very adaptive behavioral responses to help get you, into a better spot, given, what's happening around you. So as an example, like let's say you're walking around at night and, it's at dusk and, all of a sudden you hear a twig snap like right behind you, right? And something is, you can't see it yet, but you heard it. And it's clearly not properly socially distanced, and you go like, you freeze maybe, or you orient, your heart rate's going up, your mouth is dry. There are all this panoply of like kind of coordinated, sort of responses to that detection of stimuli. This is an autonomic response, and actually it's considered to be part of what's known as a fight or flight response, what the medical students learn as the 4 Fs, fight, flight, fright, and fornication. And basically it's part of a very specific functional division of the autonomic nervous system that's referred to as the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And what's interesting is it's a coordinated kind of response to, stimuli that could potentially be threatening. And it's posited in contrast to another division of the autonomic nervous system, which is called the parasympathetic division. So if you turn around and, it's just a kitten on the ground, right? And you go, oh, and you pick it up and you're not allergic to cats, right? You take it home and you're relaxing and your heart rate is dropping and things like that. Well, this is another kind of automatic kind of response to the stimuli that are in your environment. But it's counter to the sympathetic response. The medical students actually learn it as essential for salivation, lacrimation, which is crying, urination, and defecation. And so what's interesting is these are two sort of functional divisions of the autonomic nervous system, and yet if you look closely, you'll see that there are actual structural differences that distinguish these two functional components. So, for example, the primary neurons for output from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system for the sympathetic fight or flight division, begin in a nucleus. Remember, a clump of neurons that are found in the central nervous system in the spinal cord. It's called the intermediolateral cell column. And then the axons go short, just right outside the central nervous system, outside the spinal cord, to a synaptic connection with others, right? This is now we're in the peripheral nervous system, so we got some gray matter here, the connections of the cell bodies, right in this what's called a ganglia, right, or ganglion. And it turns out there's a whole series of these ganglia they're found on either side of the spinal cord called the sympathetic chain ganglia. And then there's a postsynaptic, peripheral neuron here. It's called the postganglionic, cell for the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And it's going to send a long axon out, to release neurotransmitter on, various organs in the body, like, for example, the heart. And it turns out that the neurotransmitter that it uses, the chemical that it releases from this postganglionic cell in the ganglion onto the heart, is a very specific neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. And then if we contrast that sympathetic division with all these very specific structural features, the intermedial lateral cell column, origin for the preganglionic neuron, the sympathetic chain ganglia that are nearby the cord, that are all interconnected with each other, for example, too. And then the longer postganglionic cell that releases norepinephrine on the heart, that's sympathetic. With the parasympathetic, it turns out it's a very different organization. The pre-ganglionic cell is located in the spinal cord, right? And also in the brainstem, and also in the spinal cord. This is the brainstem, by the way, not the spinal cord. Brainstem, and then the spinal cord. And then it has longer, axons out because the ganglia that are associated with the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system are right by the heart, right by the organs that they're actually going to be influencing. And then the postganglionic cell, which is shorter, actually releases a different neurotransmitter than norepinephrine. It releases acetylcholine. So what's really interesting, I think, is just how you can go at the nervous system both structurally or functionally. But if you go at it functionally, you're going to find specific structural features that tie that functional system together. I do want to mention really briefly that people often think about this autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic, parasympathetic kind of activation as sort of being all or none. Like it's just sympathetic and no parasympathetic, or just parasympathetic and no sympathetic. And that's not true. For most of us, it's going to be sort of like there's going to be a balance between the two that can shift, depending on whether there's a stimulus that provokes more sympathetic activation or stimuli that provoke more parasympathetic activation. What's also fascinating, and there's a lot of research on this, is how there's sort of developmental processes at work as we alter control over these networks, where the more sort of fine control you get over that parasympathetic system, the better you're able to regulate your emotional tone and responsiveness under different circumstances. And the final thing I want to mention just about the autonomic nervous system is that, for many years, they used to include the gut, right, as part of the parasympathetic system. But the gut is fascinating. Your, esophagus, your stomach, your small intestine, your large intestine are surrounded by these sheets of neurons. These are called plexi. And, there's, tens and tens of millions of these neurons. It's a very complicated, neuronal set of networks. The glial cells are present too. Every type of neurotransmitter released in, the brain seems to also be released in this, second brain that we kind of have in our gut. And the gut is also home to an extraordinary assemblage of, microscopic creatures, like all sorts of, bacteria and other organisms that sort of form what we call, a significant constituent of our microbiome. There's more creatures that live all on you and, other parts of you too. But there's a pretty significant, set of, organisms that we maintain an environment for, in this gut. So this is such an important system, and we're learning a lot about the connection between the gut and the brain, and how chemicals released from the microbiome can actually influence the functioning of networks in our central nervous system as well. That we often refer to this now as a separate division of the autonomic nervous system. This is referred to as the enteric division of the autonomic nervous system, and it's extraordinarily complex and fascinating. There's a lot more afferent, input to the central nervous system coming from the enteric division of the autonomic nervous system than there is motor output or efferent output to it. So you can be very aware where if something happens down here that's not pleasant, it could throw off your entire, CNS. So anyway, cheers.